The sharp, sterile bite of chilled gin and expensive floor wax hung heavy in the air at the apex, clashing with the metallic scent of the rain-slicked city pressing against the floor-to-ceiling glass. My fingers were steady as I polished a crystal flute, but beneath the hem of my crisp white uniform, my knees were locked tight to keep from shaking. I had been on the floor for 8 hours, moving through the shadows of the elite like a ghost. It was the kind of practiced stillness you only master when your older brother spends your childhood teaching you how to track a target without snapping a single dry leaf. In a room full of the city's most dangerous predators, I had learned that the best camouflage isn't a ghillie suit, it's a serving tray. The fitted white dress and the neat, low bun were my tactical gear. They allowed me to disappear into the periphery of million-dollar betrayals and whispered sins. The apex wasn't just a lounge. It was a glass cage perched 60 floors above the sidewalk, a place where the air was thin and the egos were lethal. The digital art installations on the walls cost more than the apartment I was currently 3 months behind on. Every flickering light reflected off the polished marble, illuminating the diamond watches of men who could make a person vanish with a single nod. My floor lead, Marcus, glided past me, his voice a low hiss that smelled of cheap peppermint and unearned authority. He didn't look at my face. He never did. He only looked at the wine bottle in my hand. Amara, table 4. Joon-Seok Han just arrived. He's in a mood and his security is on edge. Pour the wine, keep your mouth shut, and don't linger. I didn't answer. I just adjusted my grip on the vintage Cabernet and began the long walk across the marble floor. My eyes weren't on the wine, though. They were on the lead bodyguard by the elevators, whose hand had just twitched toward his earpiece in a sequence that meant only one thing. The hit is a go. I approached table 4 with the calculated grace of a predator disguised as prey. Joon-Seok Han sat with a stillness that was louder than the surrounding chatter of the elite. Up close, the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with every swallow of red wine, a dark omen etched against his sharp jawline. He was a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room, but as I glanced toward the glass elevators, I knew that for the first time in his life, he was a target in a cage. The lead bodyguard, a man they called the Viper, stood 10 feet away, his posture too rigid, his eyes fixed on the entrance rather than his charge. It was the same tell my brother had described 100 times, a man who had already committed to the kill. I reached the table, the vintage Cabernet heavy and cool in my hand. I leaned in, the silver neck of the bottle acting as a shield between us and the room. To anyone watching, I was merely the attentive waitress, a ghost in a white dress performing a service. But as I tilted the bottle, the dark liquid swirling into his glass, I breached the invisible boundary of his personal space. "Don't look at the elevators," I murmured, my voice a breath against his ear, barely audible over the soft jazz. Joon-Seok didn't flinch. His hand stayed wrapped around his glass, but I felt the sudden electric tension radiating from his frame. His eyes remained fixed on the center of the table, but the warmth drained from his expression, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. "Your bodyguard sold you out," I whispered, the words tasting like iron in my mouth. "They're waiting outside. 5 men, heavy tactical gear. When the elevator chime hits, the Viper is going to step aside." I finished the pour and straightened slightly, wiping the rim of the bottle with a white linen cloth. For a split second, our eyes met. It was a brief, jarring collision of 2 different worlds. In that moment, I saw the realization hit him, not fear, but a dark, sharp clarity. He looked at me not as a servant, but as a lifeline he hadn't asked for. He didn't thank me. He didn't move. He simply set the glass down with a soft clink that sounded like a hammer cocking back. "How long?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic vibration that vibrated in my very marrow. 60 seconds, I replied, tucking the cloth into my belt. "Maybe less. Follow me through the kitchen or you won't make it to the lobby." The air in the rooftop lounge suddenly felt thinner, as if the vacuum of the coming violence was already sucking the oxygen from the room. I turned away, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and began to walk. I didn't look back to see if the most powerful man in the city was following a girl in a cheap uniform. I just prayed my brother's lessons were enough to get us both out alive. I didn't wait for his permission. I pivoted on my heel, the hem of my white uniform snapping like a flag in a high wind. Behind me, the heavy slide of a chair against the marble told me Joon-Seok had made his choice. We didn't head for the panoramic elevators. Those glass coffins were already death traps. Instead, I led him toward the heavy oak doors of the pantry, the invisible staff entrance I had traversed 1,000 times. We burst into the industrial kitchen, a cavern of stainless steel and hissing steam. The chefs didn't even look up from their sauté pans until the double doors at the far end were kicked open with a violent crash. The Viper had abandoned his post, and he wasn't alone. 2 men in charcoal suits, suppressed submachine guns raised, stepped into the light of the heat lamps. "Down," Joon-Seok roared. He didn't just shout, he moved. His hand clamped onto my shoulder, shoving me behind the central prep station just as the first cough of gunfire tore through the air. The sound wasn't the thunderous boom of the movies. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thud-thud-thud that sent shards of high-end china exploding above our heads like ceramic shrapnel. "The freight lift is too slow," I gasped, my back pressed against the cold steel of a refrigerator. "The service stairs, behind the walk-in freezer. It bypasses the lobby and drops straight into the loading bay." Joon-Seok reached into the waistband of his tailored slacks, pulling a compact black handgun that looked like an extension of his own arm. He fired 2 precise shots, the recoil barely shivering his frame. A cry of pain erupted from the far side of the kitchen. "Lead," he commanded, his eyes burning with a dark, predatory heat. I scrambled toward the rear, navigating a maze of hanging copper pots and crates of imported produce. I knew every blind spot in this building, every corner where the security cameras had a 5-degree lag. I wrenched open a narrow gray door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only." The stairwell was a vertical concrete throat, lit by the flickering hum of yellowing fluorescence. We dived into the shadows just as another volley of bullets peppered the doorframe behind us. We didn't go up, we went down. The rhythmic slap of my flats against the concrete echoed like a frantic heartbeat, while Joon-Seok's heavy footsteps provided a steady, lethal counterpoint. As we spiraled down the damp, cold throat of the building, the sounds of the lounge faded, replaced by the heavy, mechanical groan of the city's underbelly. I wasn't just a waitress anymore, and he wasn't just a VIP. We were 2 ghosts running through the veins of a giant, and for the first time, the invisible girl was the only one who knew the way out. The tires of the stolen sedan screeched as we banked into a derelict parking garage beneath a nondescript apartment complex on the edge of the city. The engine died, and for a moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of cooling metal and Joon-Seok's ragged, shallow breathing. In the dim, flickering overhead light, I saw it. A dark, widening bloom of crimson across the side of his white dress shirt, right where the vest ended. "You're hit," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It grazed me," he grunted, his jaw tight as he tried to mask the tremor in his hand. He stepped out of the car, swaying for a split second before catching himself against the concrete pillar. The relaxed power he had projected at the restaurant was gone, replaced by the raw, bleeding vulnerability of a man who had been hunted. I led him up a service elevator to the 4th floor, into a gray apartment, a place my brother had kept for emergencies that he never got to use. It was sparse, smelling of dust and stale air, but it was a blind spot in the city's grid. As soon as the door bolted shut, Joon-Seok collapsed onto a wooden kitchen chair. He reached for his side, but his fingers were slick with blood, fumbling at the buttons of his vest. "Move your hands," I commanded. He paused, his dark eyes snapping up to mine. For a moment, the Mafia boss returned. The man who gave orders not took them. But the fire was dimmed by shock. I didn't wait for him to agree. I stepped into his space, my hands, practiced in the art of precision from years of delicate service and the harsh lessons of my brother's medical kits, moved with clinical efficiency. I peeled back the ruined fabric. The bullet had furrowed through the flesh of his side. It was messy, but not deep enough to hit the organs. "You're lucky," I muttered, grabbing a first aid kit from beneath the sink. "Another inch and you'd be bleeding out on my floor." I worked in silence, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that made his entire body go rigid. He didn't make a sound, but the glass of water I had set before him rattled against the table as his muscles spasmed. As I wrapped the bandage around his broad torso, pulling it taut, I realized the power dynamic had inverted. In this dusty kitchen, he wasn't the king of Seoul's underworld, and I wasn't the girl who refilled his wine. I was the one keeping him tethered to the world. He watched me, his gaze heavy and analytical, tracing the scars on my own hands, marks from a life lived in the background. "You aren't just a waitress," he rasped, his voice dropping an octave as the adrenaline began to fade. "And you aren't as untouchable as you thought," I countered, securing the tape with a final, firm press. I stood up, towering over him for the first time. "Eat the glucose tabs in that kit. Lock the door. I'm going to scan the perimeter." I turned to leave, but his hand shot out, catching my wrist. His grip wasn't violent, but it was desperate. For a heartbeat, the dragon on his neck seemed to rest. "Why did you do it, Amara? You could have let them take me. You could have stayed invisible." "Invisibility only works if you can live with what you see," I said softly, pulling away. "Rest, Joon-Seok. We're still in the kill zone." The antiseptic tang of the first aid kit lingered in the small kitchen as the adrenaline finally ebbed, leaving a heavy, ringing silence between us. Joon-Seok sat back, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He didn't look like a kingpin now. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. His dark eyes followed me as I checked the window locks, his gaze heavy with a question he had been holding back since the rooftop. "You move like a soldier, but you wear a server apron," he said, his voice sandpaper rough. "Ordinary people scream when the glass starts breaking. You didn't even blink. Why?" I stopped by the counter, my back to him, staring at the scarred wood. The memories I usually kept locked in the dark began to push against the surface. "My brother Elias was a military scout," I said softly, the name still feeling like a bruise on my heart. "He spent 10 years in the bush, learning how to see things before they happened. When he came back, he didn't see a city. He saw a series of kill zones and extraction points." I turned to face him, leaning against the sink. "He didn't teach me how to bake or how to dance. He taught me how to count the exits in a crowded room. He taught me that the person with the shifty eyes isn't the threat. It's the one who is too still. He taught me that being invisible is the greatest tactical advantage a person can have." Joon-Seok watched me, the dragon on his neck shifting as he tilted his head. "And Elias, where is he now?" "Dead," I replied, the word flat and final. "He saw betrayal coming in his own unit. He tried to warn his and he ended up in a ditch in a country that didn't even know he was there. I'm a waitress because it's the only place where I can watch the world and stay out of the line of fire, or at least it was." The silence returned, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was the shared quiet of two people who understood what it meant to live looking over their shoulder. Joon-Seok reached out, his hand resting palm up on the table, a silent invitation. "I have spent my life surrounded by men who claim to be loyal," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration. "But they see the title, the power. You saw the danger before I did. You saw me." In that moment, the gap between the Mafia boss and the black waitress vanished. We were just two survivors in a forgotten apartment, tethered by a secret that could get us both killed. I looked at his hand, then at the sharp, weary clarity in his eyes. For the first time in years, the hypervigilance that usually kept me isolated felt like it was finally pointing me toward someone instead of away from them. I didn't take his hand, but I didn't step back either. We were no longer stranger and servant. We were the only two people in the city who knew the truth. The blue light of a small, outdated television in the kitchen corner cast long, flickering shadows against the peeling wallpaper of the safe house. I stood with my arms crossed, watching the local news ticker crawl across the bottom of the screen. "Breaking! Explosions at Han Enterprises HQ. Authorities confirm Joon-Seok Han missing. Presumed dead in attempted coup." Behind me, Joon-Seok let out a low, guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a pained breath. He was standing now, his hand clutching the edge of the laminate table so hard his knuckles turned white. On the screen, the image shifted to a grainy cell phone video of his nightclub, the Onyx, surrounded by black SUVs. Men in suits, his suits were hauling out crates and roughing up the staff. I recognized the lead man immediately, the Viper. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was seizing the throne while it was still warm. "They aren't just taking your money," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "They're erasing you. By morning, every loyalist you have will be dead or bought." Joon-Seok turned toward me, his face a mask of cold fury. "I need to get to the docks. My brother has a cell there that might still be loyal." "You won't make it 2 blocks," I countered, stepping into his path. "Look at the street feeds." I pulled up a localized traffic app on my phone, showing the red clusters of accidents at every major intersection surrounding this district. "They've set up a perimeter," I explained, pointing to the patterns. "They're flushing the city block by block. If we run now, we're just targets in a shooting gallery. My brother used to say that when the woods are on fire, you don't run from the flames. You find the person who lit the match and take their air." Joon-Seok leaned back against the counter, his eyes narrowing as he processed the tactical reality. The city he had built was burning, and the smoke was meant to blind him. "The Viper thinks I'm a ghost," he rasped, a dark, dangerous smile finally tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He thinks he's fighting a memory." "Then let's give him a haunting he'll never forget," I said. The fear that had been my constant companion for years was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a weight, it was an edge. "We can't outrun a city on fire, Joon-Seok. We have to start a backfire. We strike the traitors where they feel safest, before they realize the dead man is standing right behind them." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw the shift in his eyes. I wasn't his savior anymore. I was his strategist. The invisible waitress was gone, the scout had arrived. The transformation was as simple as it was terrifying. I traded my brother's tactical gear for a silk vest and a pair of tailored slacks, pinning a generic staff badge to my chest. The venue was the Gilded Cage, a private social club where the air smelled of aged bourbon and the sweat of men who bought and sold lives. In this world, a waitress was just a piece of moving furniture, functional, necessary, and entirely forgettable. Joon-Seok watched me from the shadows of the service van, his eyes dark with a mix of pride and agonizing restraint. He hated that I was the one walking into the fire, but we both knew the truth. His face was a death sentence. Mine was a ghost. 5 minutes, he'd whispered before I slipped out. "In and out, don't be a hero, Amara, just be a shadow." Inside, the room was thick with tension. 3 rival syndicate bosses sat at a low mahogany table, their bodyguards fanning out like crows. At the center of the table sat the Viper, lounging in the seat that belonged to Joon-Seok. He looked different, bolder, louder, like a man who had finally stopped pretending to serve. I moved through the room with a silver tray balanced on my fingertips, my gaze lowered but my ears tuned to the frequency of betrayal. I poured their scotch with a steady hand, the amber liquid catching the low light. The Viper was laughing, a dry, jagged sound. "The docks are secure," the Viper said, leaning forward. "But we move the final shipment tonight from the old cannery at Pier 14. Once the money clears, Joon-Seok's legacy is officially buried." I moved to the side table to refresh the ice bucket, my fingers grazing the underside of the wood to plant the tiny transmitter Joon-Seok had given me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, but my face remained a mask of bored professionalism. "And the girl?" one of the other bosses asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The waitress who took him." The Viper's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "She's a loose end. My men are sweeping the transit tunnels. She won't survive the night." I felt his gaze brush past me, a cold, dismissive sweep that didn't even pause. I was just a girl with a tray. He didn't see the daughter of a scout. He didn't see the woman who had patched up his enemy. He saw nothing. I turned and walked toward the kitchen doors, every step feeling like a mile. As soon as the heavy swinging doors closed behind me, I didn't stop. I bypassed the dish pit and slipped out the delivery entrance. The night air hit my face, sharp and cold. I reached the van, sliding the door open before it even fully stopped. Joon-Seok was there, his hand reaching out to pull me in. "Pier 14, I gasped, the adrenaline finally breaking my voice. "The cannery, they're moving tonight." He didn't say a word. He just pulled me against his chest for a single, brief second, a collision of gratitude and fury, before his face hardened into the mask of the man who was about to take back his city. The intel was gathered. The invisibility had served its purpose. Now it was time for the dragon to wake up. The fog at Pier 14 was a thick, salty shroud that tasted of rust and impending rain. I lay prone on the rusted corrugated roof of the abandoned cannery, the cold metal seeping through my clothes. Beneath me, the long-range rifle, a relic of my brother's scout days, felt like a heavy, living thing. My eye was pressed to the optic, the crosshairs dancing slightly with my breath until I forced my lungs into the rhythmic, shallow cycle Elias had taught me. Below, in the amber glow of a flickering street lamp, Joon-Seok stood alone. He looked like a tragic king in his tattered suit, his hands empty, his silhouette a target against the dark water of the harbor. A black SUV drifted into the frame of my scope. The door opened, and the Viper stepped out, flanked by 4 men. He was smiling, that arrogant, jagged twist of the lips that signaled his belief that he had already won. He didn't see the shadow on the roof. He didn't see the girl who had spent a lifetime being overlooked. "You should have stayed dead, Joon-Seok." The Viper's voice echoed up to me, thin and distorted by the wind. "It would have been cleaner." "I don't like clean, Marcus," Joon-Seok replied, his voice a steady, terrifying calm. "I like right." I watched through the lens as the Viper's hand moved toward his jacket, a slow, confident reach for a weapon. My finger tightened on the trigger. In that heartbeat, the world narrowed to a single point. I wasn't a witness anymore. I wasn't just a girl watching the world through a glass cage. I was the hand of fate. I exhaled, the air leaving my chest in a steady stream, and squeezed. The rifle kicked hard into my shoulder, a violent, honest jolt. The sound was a thunderclap that shattered the silence of the docks. Down in the circle of light, the Viper's shoulder erupted in a spray of red, the force of the high-caliber round spinning him around before he could draw his gun. "Sniper!" one of the guards screamed, scrambling for cover. I didn't panic. I adjusted the turret, dialed in 3 clicks left, and fired again, catching the wheel of the SUV just as it tried to roar into motion. The tire disintegrated, the vehicle sagging into the asphalt. Joon-Seok didn't waste a second. He moved with a blurred, lethal efficiency, closing the distance while the traitors were still reeling from the shock of an attack they never saw coming. As he neutralized the remaining guards, I stayed on the glass, my hands steady, my heart a cold, quiet engine. I had crossed the bridge. The uniform was a memory, the invisibility was now a weapon. As I chambered the next round, I realized I wasn't just protecting Joon-Seok, I was claiming the power my brother had tried to give me. I was the scout in the shadows, and for the first time I wasn't running. I was hunting. The secondary cannery was a graveyard of rusted machinery and long shadows, the perfect stage for a final reckoning. We had bled the Viper's forces at the docks, but the remaining hit squad was the elite, the cleaners who didn't miss. I crouched in the rafters, my silhouette lost among the jagged iron beams. Below, Joon-Seok walked into the center of the kill zone, his white shirt stained and his dragon tattoo bared, the ultimate bait. "Is this where it ends, Joon-Seok?" A voice boomed from the darkness. 3 men emerged from the steam pipe fog, their weapons raised. They moved with a professional spread, closing the circle. They thought they had him cornered. They didn't realize that in this room, Joon-Seok was the anvil and I was the hammer. "No," Joon-Seok said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register. "This is where I take out the trash." He dived behind a heavy iron boiler just as the muzzle flashes lit the room. That was my cue. I didn't use the rifle this time. The close quarters demanded speed. I dropped a smoke canister from the rafters, the thick gray haze blossoming instantly to swallow the floor. The hitmen hesitated, their infrared sights blooming uselessly in the chemically thickened air. I descended the service ladder like a phantom, my boots hitting the concrete without a sound. I moved through the fog, guided by the rhythmic clanging Joon-Seok was making, a tactical acoustic signal we'd agreed upon. One hitman passed me, his head swiveling frantically. I stepped from his blind spot, my brother's combat knife finding the gap in his tactical vest with surgical precision. He went down before he could draw a breath. Across the room, a flash of movement. Joon-Seok surged from behind a crate, his handgun barking 3 times. 2 more targets fell, caught in the crossfire of a man they thought was wounded and a woman they didn't believe existed. We moved in a lethal, unspoken dance. Every time they turned to face the boss, the scout was already behind them. Every time they tried to pin me down, Joon-Seok suppressed them with a hail of lead. Finally, only the Viper's second-in-command remained, backing away into the light of a single hanging bulb. He looked up, sensing me, then down at Joon-Seok. He was caught between a ghost and a god. "Your mistake," Joon-Seok rasped, stepping into the light, was thinking she was just a witness. I stepped out from the shadows behind the man, my gaze cold and steady. "And your mistake," I added, was thinking I was just a waitress. The synchronization was perfect. As the man turned to fire at me, Joon-Seok's shot took him in the chest. He fell in the silence that followed, the only sound the distant drip of water and the heavy, synchronized breathing of 2 survivors. The wrath was over. The trap had closed. And as Joon-Seok looked at me through the settling smoke, the dragon on his neck finally seemed at peace. The silence following the final gunshot was heavier than the violence that preceded it. Joon-Seok stood amidst the wreckage of his former life, the steam from the punctured pipes curling around him like dragon's breath. He turned to me, and for the first time, he didn't look at me as a lucky accident or a tactical asset. He looked at me as his equal. He walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, and stopped just inches away. The elite Mafia boss, the man who had the city in a chokehold, bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect that I knew he afforded no one else. "The girl who served the wine is dead," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "The city thinks you are a ghost. Let them keep their ghost. I need the woman who saw through the smoke when no one else could." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, obsidian-sealed envelope, the deeds and keys to a territory that had once belonged to the traders. "There is a seat at the high table, Amara. Not behind me, but beside me. I want you as my North Star." I looked down at the envelope, then at my own hands. They were stained with the oil and grime of the cannery, the grit of survival. I thought of the worn black flats and the invisible armor of the white dress that had been my prison for so long. That night, we didn't return to the rooftop lounge. We went to the edge of the Han River, where the water was black and deep, reflecting the neon veins of the city we had just reclaimed. I stood by a small metal drum, the flickering flames inside licking at the cold night air. Without a word, I reached into my bag and pulled out the fitted white waitress uniform, the costume of a woman who was tired of being overlooked. I tossed it into the fire. The fabric shriveled and blackened, the white silk surrendering to the orange heat. As the smoke rose into the soul sky, I felt the weight of my brother's legacy and my own fear lift with it. I wasn't just a scout anymore, and I was certainly no one's servant. Joon-Seok draped his own tailored black jacket over my shoulders, the scent of expensive cologne and iron grounding me. He placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the waiting car. I stepped into the leather interior, not as a witness to someone else's important night, but as the architect of my own. The city lights sparkled below us, no longer a glass cage but a kingdom. I had burned the uniform, and in its place, I had found my power. Finally, for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Seen, respected, and untouchable.